Two 18-year-old Apache sisters asked the rancher for shelter. He said, "Only if you'll be my wives before dawn." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Ayanna stared at the weathered man standing in his doorway, his face a roadmap of hard sun and harder years. Rain streamed down her face, cold as death, and her sister Kaya gripped her arm with trembling fingers. They had walked for 3 days through hostile territory, sleeping in ditches and eating what they could find, always listening for the sound of horses behind them. They were dodging men who wanted them for reasons they couldn't even speak aloud, only to find refuge with someone who seemed just as dangerous. But something was wrong with this picture. The rancher's eyes held no desire, no hunger. They held a strange kind of fear. His hands shook as he spoke the words, like he was repeating something he barely understood, something he was forced to say. Behind him, in the dim light of his cabin, candles flickered in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, and strange symbols were carved into the wooden beam above his head, symbols Ayanna had never seen before. "That's the law," he said, but his voice cracked like a boy's. That's what has to happen." What law? What possible tradition demanded such a thing from a stranger? And why did his face look like he was more terrified of his own words than they were? The storm was getting worse, the wind howling like a hungry animal. And in the distance, they could hear something else. A sound that made their blood run cold. Hoofbeats, steady, relentless, getting closer. The men who had been tracking them for days, the men they had barely escaped, were almost here. Now they faced an impossible choice. Accept this stranger's bizarre, terrifying demand, or face the certain brutality waiting for them in the darkness. Ayanna looked into the rancher's eyes one more time, searching for the truth. And that's when she saw it. Something that changed everything. Something that made her realize this night would be nothing like what any of them expected. Because the biggest mystery wasn't what this man wanted from them. It was why he looked like he was trying to save them from something far worse than marriage. Lightning split the sky like a wound, illuminating Boone Carter's face as he stepped back from the doorway. The two Apache women stood dripping on his porch, their dark hair plastered against their heads, their eyes wide with something between desperation and defiance. Ayanna, the older sister, straightened her shoulders despite the cold rain soaking through her worn leather dress. "We need shelter until morning," she said, her voice sharp. "Nothing more." Boone's jaw tightened. He glanced past them into the darkness where the storm raged with unusual violence for this time of year. His cattle would be scattered across 3 valleys by dawn, and his roof leaked in 4 places. But that wasn't what made his hands shake. That wasn't what made his heart pound against his ribs. "Can't do it," he said, his voice as rough as sandpaper. "Not unless—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat like fishbones. Kaya, the younger sister, pressed closer to Ayanna. She was quieter than her sister, more observant. And she had noticed something Ayanna missed. The way Boone kept looking over their shoulders, as if expecting company. Bad company. "Unless what?" Ayanna demanded, the rain streaming down her face like angry tears. Boone ran a hand through his gray-streaked hair, his mind screaming. His grandfather's words echoed in his memory, spoken on his deathbed 3 years ago, the old man's breath smelling of dust and regret. When Apache women seek shelter in the storm and dark riders follow their trail, only marriage bonds can protect them. It's the old law, boy, the only law that matters when blood runs hot. At the time, he'd thought it was just delirium talking. Now, hearing those hoofbeats in the distance, he understood it was a prophecy. It was survival. "Only if you'll be my wives before dawn," he said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. Ayanna's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of the small knife at her belt. "You're insane." "Maybe," Boone said, his eyes pleading with her to understand. He stepped aside, letting them see into the cabin. But look at my walls. The sisters followed his gaze. Carved into the wooden beams were symbols, but they weren't mystical markings. They were practical warnings, left by travelers over the years. Messages about safe water, dangerous crossings, hostile territories. A traveler's language, a code of survival on the frontier. And there, right near the door, was a fresh carving that made Ayana's blood run cold. 3 vertical lines, crossed by 1 horizontal one. The mark that meant hunters tracking women. Beneath it, a single, grim word. Death. Who made that? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Jim Fletcher, Boone said, his voice low. Came through 2 days ago. Said there were men in town asking about 2 Apache sisters. Said they weren't the kind of men who take no for an answer. Boone's eyes were as hard as flint now, the fear replaced by a grim determination. Said they'd be here by midnight. As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of horses cut through the storm, the hoofbeats slapping against the wet ground, getting closer, much closer. Kaya grabbed her sister's arm, her knuckles white. Ayana, those are the same men who… I know. Ayana cut her off, her mind racing like a runaway train. They had escaped those men once, barely, 3 nights ago. They had scrambled down a ravine in the dark, leaving a false trail. But they wouldn't escape twice. Not in this storm, not with nowhere left to run. She looked back at Boone, whose face held no trace of desire, only the grim resolve of a man facing his own execution. Why marriage? She demanded. Why not just hide us? Because, Boone said, already moving toward his rifle rack, his movements economical and sure. Married Apache women under a white man's protection have legal standing. There are statutes, laws. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Unmarried ones were just property, vagrants, fair game. The hoofbeats were getting closer, much closer now. They were almost at the edge of his property, and Ayana realized with a sickening lurch that this strange, terrifying night had only just begun. The door didn't just open. It exploded inward, with a crash that shook the entire cabin, splintered wood flying across the room. Clyde Hargrove filled the doorframe like a bear, water streaming from his black coat, his pale eyes scanning the room until they found the sisters cowering near the hearth. There you are, pretty ones, he growled, stepping inside without invitation. 4 more men crowded behind him, all armed, all wearing the same predatory smile. They smelled of wet leather, cheap whiskey, and violence. Been chasing you for 3 days through this god-forsaken country. Boone stepped between Hargrove and the women, the long barrel of his rifle trained squarely on the intruder's chest. You're trespassing on my land, Hargrove. Get out. Hargrove laughed, a sound like gravel churning in a bucket. Your land? This whole territory is changing hands, Carter. New mining operations up north. They need workers, all kinds of workers. His gaze lingered on Kaya, who pressed herself closer to her sister, trying to become invisible. We're not workers, Ayana said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. We're people. Not according to the law, one of Hargrove's men sneered from the doorway. Apache women caught off reservation land are considered vagrants. We're just doing our civic duty, helping them find employment. Boone's finger tightened on the trigger, the first joint turning white. That's not how the law works, and you know it. Depends on who's interpreting the law, Hargrove said, his smile widening. He took another step forward, completely ignoring the rifle pointed at his heart. See, Carter, this is the reality of the situation. You can shoot one of us, maybe 2 if you're lucky, but you can't shoot all 5 of us. And when you're dead, we take the girls anyway. Your cabin burns down. It's a tragic accident. Ayana felt time slowing to a crawl. In her peripheral vision, she could see Kaya trembling, could hear Boone's labored breathing, could smell the rain and mud and pure evil that filled the small cabin. Everything her grandmother had ever taught her about survival came flooding back into her mind. When you are cornered by wolves, you must become something they don't expect. Not a sheep, not another wolf. Something else entirely. "I accept," she said suddenly. Everyone froze. The wind howled through the broken doorway, but inside the cabin there was only a stunned, electric silence. Hargrove blinked in confusion, his predatory grin faltering. Boone's rifle wavered slightly, his eyes wide with shock. Kaya stared at her sister as if she'd grown a second head. "Accept what?" Hargrove finally demanded, his voice thick with suspicion. Ayanna stepped forward, away from the hearth, her chin raised in defiance. "His proposal. We accept marriage to Boone Carter, under tribal law and under territorial law, witnessed by all of you present." She reached back and grabbed Kaya's hand, pulling her forward. "Both of us. Right now." "The hell you do," Hargrove snarled, the color rising in his face. "Those girls are coming with us." "No," Boone said, understanding flooding his face, chasing away the shock. "They're not." He finally understood the full power of his grandfather's words. It wasn't just a promise, it was a weapon. Because under Territorial Statute 247, married Apache women under the legal protection of a white husband cannot be removed from their husband's land without a federal marshal's warrant. And the nearest federal marshal is a 3-day ride from here. You know that, Hargrove. Hargrove's face turned a mottled shade of purple with rage. "You can't marry them without a preacher." "Actually," Ayanna said, her voice gaining strength with every word, feeding on the shock of her enemies. "Under Apache law, witnessed vows spoken before dawn create a binding marriage. Your presence here, right now, makes you legal witnesses, whether you want to be or not." The silence stretched like a bowstring. Rain drummed on the roof. Lightning flashed, illuminating the faces of 5 very dangerous men who were just now realizing that their prey had just become legally, impossibly, untouchably safe. "This is horse shit," one of Hargrove's men muttered, spitting on the floor. But Hargrove wasn't listening. He was studying Boone's face, looking for any sign of weakness, any hint of doubt. What he found there made him take an involuntary step backward. "You'd really do it?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and fury. "You'd really marry 2 Apache girls just to spite me?" Boone never took his eyes off Hargrove. He never took the rifle off his chest. "I'd marry them to save them," he said, his voice cold as a grave. "Whether that spites you is just good fortune." Hargrove's hand dropped to the butt of his pistol. The cabin held its breath. The moment hung on a razor's edge, ready to fall into bloodshed. And that's when they heard it. Something that changed everything. Another horse, a single rider, approaching through the storm. But this rider wasn't one of Hargrove's men. This one was riding hard, fast, like someone bringing news that couldn't possibly wait until morning. The new horse was coming on fast, its hoofbeats a frantic counterpoint to the steady drumming of the rain. Hargrove spun toward the window, his hand still hovering over his gun, his face a mask of confusion. "Who the hell is that?" "Deputy Marshal Jim Fletcher," Boone said, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He recognized the distinctive rhythm of the horse's gait. Territorial law enforcement. Hargrove's face went from purple to white. A deputy marshal. Here. Now. That complicated everything, especially if he was about to witness 5 men trying to drag 2 women out of a cabin against their will. Fletcher's voice boomed through the storm before he even dismounted, a voice used to commanding attention and obedience. "Hargrove, I know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible." "Damn it," one of Hargrove's men whispered, backing toward the broken door. "Boss, we need to go. Now." But Hargrove wasn't backing down. Not yet. His eyes burned with the fury of a man who'd traveled 3 days through hell, only to watch his prize slip through his fingers at the last possible second. "We finish this first," he snarled. "Those girls are coming with us, law or no law." "No," Ayanna said, stepping closer to Boone, so close their shoulders were touching. She felt the warmth from his body, the solid strength of him. "We're not." She turned to face Kaya, whose eyes were wide with fear, but also a dawning understanding. Kaya nodded slowly, a silent agreement passing between them. A choice had been made. Ayanna turned back to face the room, her voice carrying the formal, sacred cadence of the tribal ceremonies of her people. "Boone Carter," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "I take you as husband, under the sacred laws of my ancestors and the territorial laws of this land. I offer my protection in exchange for yours, my loyalty in exchange for yours, until death or mutual release parts us." Kaya stepped forward, her young voice surprisingly strong, echoing her sister's vow. "Boone Carter, I take you as husband, under the sacred laws of my ancestors and the territorial laws of this land. I offer my protection in exchange for yours, my loyalty in exchange for yours, until death or mutual release parts us." Boone looked from one sister to the other, into their dark, earnest eyes. He saw no fear, only resolve. He felt the weight of his grandfather's promise settling on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle of honor. He lowered his rifle just enough to show respect. "Ayanna and Kaya," he said, his voice steady and solemn, "I take you both as wives, under tribal law and territorial law. I offer my protection in exchange for yours, my loyalty in exchange for yours, until death or mutual release parts us." Fletcher pounded on the broken doorframe with his fist. "Everyone inside, come out slowly. Now." "It's done," Boone said quietly, his eyes locked on Hargrove, witnessed and binding. Hargrove drew his gun, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. "Like hell it is!" But before anyone could move, before any shot could be fired, Deputy Fletcher stepped into the doorway. His marshal's badge gleamed in the candlelight, and his own weapon was drawn and steady. He took in the entire scene in a single, sweeping glance. The destroyed door, 5 armed men facing off against 1 rancher and 2 young women, the smell of violence hanging thick in the air. "Well, well," Fletcher said, his voice laced with tired irony. "Clyde Hargrove. I should have known." His eyes found the sisters, standing beside Boone. "These the Apache women you've been tracking?" "They're fugitives," Hargrove said desperately, his plan crumbling around him. "They're off reservation land without permits." "Actually," Fletcher said, slowly holstering his gun, a small, grim smile playing on his lips, "they're not." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, official-looking document, sealed with wax. "I just rode in from territorial headquarters. These women aren't fugitives, Hargrove." He unfolded the paper. "They're witnesses, in a federal case against corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the hiss of the rain. "What?" Ayanna whispered, the word stolen from her lungs. Fletcher's expression was grim. "Your father sent word to the federal authorities before he died, about Indian agents selling Apache women to mining camps, about officials taking bribes to look the other way." He looked directly at Hargrove, his eyes cold and hard. "About men like you, profiting from human misery." Hargrove's gun wavered, his hand trembling. That's impossible." "Your father was a brave man," Fletcher told the sisters, his voice softening slightly, "and his evidence is going to hang a lot of powerful people." He smiled coldly at Hargrove, a predator's smile. "Starting with you." But Hargrove wasn't finished. With nothing left to lose, with the walls of the law closing in on him, He made the one choice that would determine whether anyone in that cabin lived to see the dawn. Hargrove's face twisted into a mask of desperate rage. In one fluid, brutal motion, he lunged forward, grabbed Kaya around the throat, and pressed the cold steel of his gun to her head. "Nobody moves," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic, "or the girl dies." "Hargrove, don't!" Fletcher shouted, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon. But he didn't dare draw, not with Kaya in the direct line of fire. "You want to talk about law?" Hargrove snarled, dragging the terrified girl backward toward the rear door of the cabin. "Here's my law. I'm walking out of here with at least one of these girls as insurance. Or, she dies right here, right now." Kaya's eyes were wide with terror, but she didn't scream, didn't struggle. Ayanna started forward, her hand on her knife, a guttural cry rising in her throat, but Boone caught her arm in a grip of iron. "Wait," he whispered, his eyes fixed on Hargrove, calculating. "You killed my whole operation," Hargrove continued, his voice rising to a shriek. 5 years. 5 years building contacts, buying officials, setting up routes. You think I'm going to prison for that? You think I'm going to hang for you?" "Maybe we can work something out," Fletcher said carefully, his hands held up, visible and empty. "Let the girl go, Hargrove. We can talk." Hargrove laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Talk? Like you talked to Agent Morrison before you put a bullet in his back? Like you talked to Commissioner Bradley before he accidentally fell off that cliff during a hunting trip?" Fletcher's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, you don't know?" Hargrove's grip on Kaya tightened, making her gasp for air. "Your federal investigation isn't as secret as you think. Half the men you're after are already dead. Convenient accidents, every single one. And you know who's been cleaning house? The man who wants to make sure no one ever finds out who the real mastermind was." The cabin fell silent, except for the sound of the rain and Kaya's labored breathing. Hargrove let the name drop into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Samuel Crowdog. He looked at the sisters, a savage, triumphant grin spreading across his face. These girls' own uncle, been killing every white man connected to the trafficking operation, one by one, including their dear old daddy. Ayanna's blood turned to ice in her veins. "That's impossible. Uncle Samuel would never—" "Your daddy didn't die of a fever," Hargrove spat, his eyes glittering with malice. "Samuel put a blade between his ribs because he was in too deep with us. He'd been feeding us information for years. Information about Apache families, about which women had no male relatives to protect them. Your own father sold you to us girls, and your uncle's been covering it all up, silencing everyone who knew ever since." Kaya made a small, broken sound, a sob of pure agony. Ayanna felt the world tilting beneath her feet, the floor of the cabin turning to sand. "Shut up," Boone said quietly, his voice dangerously low. "You're lying." "Am I?" Hargrove's eyes glittered. "Ask them why they were really running. They weren't running from us. They were running from him. From Samuel. Because he's coming for them next. Can't have any witnesses left to tell the world what their father really was." And then, through the storm, impossibly, they heard something that made everyone's blood freeze in their veins. A wolf howl, long and mournful, cutting through the rain like a blade of sound. But it wasn't a wolf. It was a signal Ayanna and Kaya knew from childhood. And Samuel Crow Dog was somewhere out there in the darkness, getting closer. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hargrove said with a savage grin, his eyes wild with a mad glee, "I believe your real problem just arrived." Fletcher spun toward the window, trying to peer into the storm-blackened night, his face a grimace of disbelief. That single moment of distraction was all Hargrove needed. He tightened his grip on Kaya, preparing to bolt through the back door. But he wasn't the only one who'd been waiting for the right moment. With the instincts of a cornered animal, Kaya drove her elbow back, hard, into Hargrove's ribs. The impact was solid, brutal, Hargrove grunted in pain, his grip loosening for just a split second, but a split second was all she needed. She twisted away from his gun, dropping to the floor. Fletcher's shot boomed through the cabin, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet caught Hargrove in the shoulder, spinning him around. But the wounded man still had fight left in him. He raised his pistol, his face a mask of blood and fury, and aimed it directly at Ayanna. Boone's rifle cracked, a heartbeat after Fletcher's shot. Hargrove crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut, his pistol clattering on the wooden planks. Is he dead? Kaya whispered, pressing herself against the far wall, her body trembling uncontrollably. Fletcher knelt beside Hargrove's still form, checking for a pulse. No, he said grimly, but he won't be causing trouble for a while. He looked up, his gaze finding the sisters. We need to talk about what he said, about your father, about Samuel. Ayanna's face was like stone, but her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists. My father was a good man, she said, the words a desperate prayer. He would never— Your father was a desperate man. A new voice spoke from the darkness outside, a voice that was both familiar and terrifying. Samuel Crow Dog stepped through the broken doorway like a ghost made of flesh and rainwater. He was tall and lean, with graying hair braided down his back and eyes that looked like they had seen too much of the world's sorrow. Water streamed from his buckskin jacket, and a long, wicked-looking knife hung at his side. Uncle Samuel? Kaya breathed, a mix of terror and relief in her voice. Hello, little ones, he said softly, his eyes taking in the scene. I've been looking for you. Fletcher's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but Samuel made no threatening gestures. Instead, he walked to Hargrove's unconscious form and stared down at him with a look of profound disgust. This one spoke some truth, Samuel said, his voice heavy with ancient grief. But not all of it. Your father did give information to these men, but not willingly. What do you mean? Ayanna demanded, her heart hammering against her ribs. Samuel's weathered face creased with pain. They took your mother first, he said, and the words fell like stones into the silence. They came in the night. They told your father they would sell her to the mining camps unless he helped them, unless he identified other families. Families with daughters of age, and few men to protect them. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. He tried to resist. He tried to fight them, but your mother died trying to escape them. After that, your father had nothing left but grief and guilt. He was a broken man. The cabin was silent, the only sounds the dripping rain and Hargrove's labored, unconscious breathing. I found your father 3 moons ago, Samuel continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. He was dying, from the poison he had taken to end his shame. With his last breath, he told me everything, and he begged me to find you, to keep you safe. He straightened up, his eyes meeting Fletcher's. So I began hunting the men who destroyed our family, not for revenge, for justice. The federal investigation? Fletcher said suddenly, understanding dawning on his face. The evidence against the Bureau? It was mine, Samuel said simply. I used your father's records, his correspondence with these criminals, to build the case. I wanted them all to hang legally, not die by my blade. Ayanna stared at her uncle, her mind reeling. But Hargrove, he said you were coming for us, that you were cleaning house. Samuel's expression grew gentle, the hard lines of his face softening. I was coming for you, child, to bring you home safely. He glanced at Boone, then at both sisters, his eyes filled with a sad understanding. Though I see you have already found protection. The wolf howl sounded again, closer this time, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Samuel smiled grimly. That's not a signal, little ones. he said. That's a warning. He looked toward the broken door. Because Hargrove and his filth weren't the only ones tracking you tonight. Outside, in the storm, shapes began to move in the darkness. More men, more guns, more danger, and the dawn was still hours away. The shapes in the darkness materialized out of the rain and gloom, resolving into 5 mounted men. But these weren't more of Hargrove's thugs. They wore the dark blue uniforms of the territorial cavalry, their brass buttons gleaming faintly in the lamplight spilling from the cabin. Federal marshals, Fletcher breathed, a wave of profound relief flooding his voice. I sent word for backup before I rode out. A man with captain's bars on his shoulders, Captain Morrison, rode up to the broken doorway, his horse snorting and stamping in the mud. His eyes swept the cabin, taking in the wounded man on the floor, the 2 frightened sisters, the grim-faced Apache man, and Boone, who was still holding his rifle at a low ready. Deputy Fletcher, the captain said, his voice crisp and official. We got your message about Hargrove's operation. Captain, thank God, Fletcher said, stepping forward. We've got Hargrove, but there are more men involved, a whole network. The whole network is finished, Morrison interrupted, swinging down from his horse. We've been rounding them up all week. Indian Agent Bradley, Commissioner Walsh, even some of the territorial judges. It goes deeper than we ever imagined. He looked at Fletcher with respect. Your evidence was solid, Fletcher. Then he turned his gaze to Samuel. And your source was thorough. Samuel nodded grimly. Justice, not revenge. As it should be. Ayanna felt something loosening inside her chest, a knot of tension she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. It's really over? The trafficking ring is broken, Morrison confirmed, and these men will hang for what they've done. He gestured to 2 of his soldiers. Take Hargrove. He needs medical attention before he stands trial. As the soldiers lifted Hargrove's unconscious form, his eyes fluttered open. He looked around the cabin with a dazed confusion, then his gaze focused on Ayanna, and his expression filled with pure, undiluted hatred. This isn't over, he wheezed, blood flecking his lips. There are others. Men you'll never find. They'll come for you. Let them come, Boone said quietly, his voice a low rumble. These women are under my protection now. Legal protection. Morrison raised an eyebrow, a hint of a question in his voice. Protection? They're married, Fletcher said, a small, tired smile touching his lips. Witnessed ceremony, binding under territorial law. Samuel studied his niece's faces, seeing the exhaustion and the terror, but also a flicker of something new. He then looked at Boone Carter, a long, measuring look from one man to another. This marriage, he said, his voice soft but clear. It was for protection only? The question hung in the air like smoke. Ayanna found herself looking at Boone, really looking at him for the first time since this nightmare began. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't hesitated. He had risked his life for 2 complete strangers, honored a promise to his long-dead grandfather, and shown more courage and decency than any man she had ever known. It started that way, she said slowly, her voice barely a whisper. But, Kaya asked softly, her eyes moving between her sister and the rancher. Ayanna met Boone's eyes, and for the first time she didn't see a stranger or a savior. She saw a man, a good man. But I think it might be something more, she said, if he's willing. A slow, tired smile spread across Boone's weathered face, reaching his eyes. I'd be honored to be your husband in truth, Ayanna, he said. Both of you, if that's what you want. Kaya looked from her sister to Boone and then to her uncle, her expression full of uncertainty. Uncle, she asked, is this right? Is this what Father would have wanted? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the 3 of them. Then he smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all night. a smile that seemed to erase years of pain from his face. "Your father wanted you to be safe," he said, "and happy. This man has proven himself worthy of ensuring both." He stepped forward and placed a hand on Boone's shoulder. "But if you ever harm them, rancher," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper, "you will answer to me." "I understand," Boone said solemnly, meeting his gaze without fear. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to break. Through a rift in the clouds, the first pale, gray light of dawn crept across the horizon. The long, dark night was finally ending. But for the three of them, a new life together was just beginning. 3 months later, Ayanna stood on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching the sunset paint the valley in hues of orange and purple. This valley had become her home. The broken door had been replaced with one of solid oak, carved by Samuel's skilled hands. The roof no longer leaked, and the vegetable garden she and Kaya had planted was thriving, promising a good harvest. Boone emerged from the barn, leading his horse to the corral after a long day spent mending fences with Samuel. The warrior had decided to stay on the ranch rather than return to the reservation, and the three of them had formed an unlikely but powerful partnership. Boone provided the land and his deep knowledge of cattle. Samuel brought his unparalleled skills as a tracker and hunter. And the sisters contributed their knowledge of herbs, healing, and traditional Apache crafts, which were now selling for a good price in the nearby town. "How did the trial go?" Ayanna asked as Boone climbed the porch steps, his boots heavy with the dust of the day. "Hargrove was sentenced to hang," Boone said simply. "Commissioner Walsh got 20 years. The rest of them all got various sentences for their parts in it." He settled beside her on the sturdy wooden bench he'd built for her. "Fletcher says the federal judge was so impressed with Samuel's evidence gathering, he might offer him a permanent position as a territorial investigator." Kaya appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, a warm, comforting smell of baking bread wafting out behind her. "Supper's ready," she announced. "Samuel shot 2 rabbits today, and I made that cornbread you like so much, Boone." As they gathered around the heavy table Samuel had crafted from pine logs, Ayanna marveled at how natural this life had become. The marriage that had begun as a desperate act of protection had slowly, quietly, evolved into a genuine partnership, built on respect and a shared sense of survival. Boone treated both sisters with a gentle kindness, never demanding more than they were willing to give, always patient as they healed from the deep traumas of their past. "I received a letter from our cousin Maria today," Kaya announced as she served the steaming cornbread. "She and her family want to visit next month to see that we are well." "They're welcome," Boone said without a moment's hesitation. "We have plenty of room." Samuel smiled, a rare but warm sight. "This ranch is becoming a gathering place for the family, a safe harbor. Your father would be proud." Ayanna reached across the table and squeezed her uncle's weathered hand. "He would be proud of you too, Uncle, for choosing justice over revenge." "Justice served everyone better," Samuel replied, his eyes content, "and it brought us all here, to this good life." After supper, as the three of them sat on the porch, watching the first stars emerge in the clear, dark sky, Boone finally asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Are you happy here?" he asked quietly, looking from Ayanna to Kaya. "Both of you? This wasn't the life you planned." Ayanna leaned against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago. "Plans change," she said softly. "Sometimes for the better." Kaya nodded from her rocking chair, her needlework resting in her lap. "We're safe," she said. "We're family. We're building something good." She smiled, a genuine, happy smile. "What more could we possibly want?" Samuel stood and stretched, his joints cracking in the cool night air. "I'm getting old. Time for bed." He paused at the door, turning back to look at them. "Boone Carter," he said, his voice full of a hard-won respect. "You have proven yourself a man of honor. My nieces chose well." As the ranch settled into a peaceful quiet, broken only by the chirping of crickets, Ayanna reflected on that terrible night when two desperate sisters had knocked on a stranger's door. They had asked for shelter, and he had demanded marriage before dawn. Now, watching Boone repair Kaya's broken chair leg by lamplight, humming softly to himself, Ayanna finally understood the truth. Sometimes, the most shocking demands hide the deepest acts of love. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.